right, everybody, welcome back to the AI Policy Podcast. We've got a barn burner of a show coming out. It is, we're talking on Wednesday, April 9th at about 2:12. And the reason I'm saying this is news is breaking by the minute. Isn't that right, Greg?
It has been an absolutely crazy 48 hours.
All right, so let's start it off with, you have some news. You just testified in front of Congress. Tell us what that was all about.
Yeah, so we had talked previously on the podcast about DeepSeek, the Chinese AI model. The House Science, Space, and Technology Committee decided to have a congressional hearing on that, and I was one of a few folks that they asked to testify about that. So it was a good opportunity to, number one, talk about this paper that I had previously written, but two, answer questions that genuinely a really diverse set of Congress is interested in understanding, because a lot of the policy making that they're trying to do in AI is in the context of competition with China. And DeepSeek is like this critical data point on what the state of the US-China AI race is.
Well, and let's not forget, before the tariffs week, before Liberation Day, all the rage, all the news was about DeepSeek and what it was going to do to AI.
Well, and it even comes back to the tariffs, because the Secretary of the Treasury, when he was asked about, the stock market, which is now officially in a bear market as of this morning, he said that actually, this stock market downturn has its origins in DeepSeek, which is true, at least in the case of the, Magnificent Seven companies. They did experience a pretty significant drop after DeepSeek, but that had mostly corrected itself.
Absolutely. They were way back up.
And then this most recent, downturn, that's not DeepSeek, that is the tariff.
And this most recent downturn is what has a lot of people upset and frustrated and really trying to understand what the strategy is. So what I want to do today is talk to you a little bit about what are the tariffs, even though President Trump has now put a 90-day pause as of, just a couple hours ago, and the markets have responded accordingly. They're going gangbusters. The Dow's up, 2,000 points. The NASDAQ's up 1,500, similar with S&P. But he did put a pause, 90 days, on every country that we've said we're going to tariff.
With one exception.
Except for China.
Yep.
Where China, we still have 104%, they have 84%, which essentially means no trade.
I think it might have gone up. I think it might now be 125%. I mean, this is jumping around.
That's why we're timing this, because it's minute by minute. But the general question I have, Greg, is what do tariffs mean for the U.S. AI ecosystem?
Sure. So I want to point out first, what is actually crossing a border in the form of trade that you can actually put a tariff on. The Trump tariffs in their initial, tranche was really focused on goods. So this is like
AI
hardware.
Is a service.
Exactly. But there is a critical hardware component of AI, which is the chips, the servers, the cooling systems, all that stuff that actually goes into building a data center that powers modern AI. And here it's so interesting because, of course, a lot of these tariffs have been rolled back, or at least have been put on a moratorium. We don't know what the final instantiation of this was. But everybody was trying to understand what is actually covered here. So, for example, in the case of Nvidia AI chips, semiconductors were supposed to be exempted, but when you are, writing tariffs, you have to go by the HS code system, right? There's like a code for literally every type of good that can theoretically be involved in international trade. And, they said, we exempted semiconductors, but if you go actually look at the HS codes, it's only like a subset of semiconductors. So there was this flurry of analytical activity trying to figure out, wait, are the GPUs covered? Are they not covered? And even if they are not covered, which I think the sort of consensus opinion at the end of the day was that actually they're going to be exempted from these tariffs, there's still all that surrounding hardware, right? Those chips are integrated into racks, that are integrated into servers, that are integrated into data centers, and that stuff was not exempted.
Okay, so what does that do to the whole process if hard equipment that really requires assembly and is a good, what does that do to the AI global system?
Well, what it basically comes down to is that these value chains are deeply international. You know, any semiconductor, when it's being manufactured, is going to cross international borders dozens of times. So even products that people might colloquially refer to as American products, like Nvidia designed chips, well, they're manufactured and assembled in Taiwan. So if you're selling that back to America, you're now being exposed to a tariff. And what Trump says is that these tariffs are a tool of industrial policy, among other things. So he's saying, hey, you can solve this problem by just building a chip-making fab in America, which TSMC has promised to do some of this. Nvidia has talked about trying to make a lot of this happen. But the challenge here is that those investments are multi-year, dozens of billions of dollars types investments.
It's going to take some time to build a high-tech plant like that, even more time than it would take to build, say, an auto plant.
Well, yeah, definitely. And certainly more capital intensive. And so if you're going to a bank saying, make me a loan, or if you're going to an investor saying, put some money up so that I can build this fab, what you need is a degree of policy stability. And I think the fact that literally the way we were going to talk about this issue on this podcast has whipsawed multiple times just in the past 48 hours, that is not an environment of policy stability. So it's sort of hard to go to investors until we have more clarity on what is a durable state of trade policy going to be.
So this means for our cutting edge AI chips, what? That we might produce less of them, that it's more expensive? What are some of the outcomes?
Well, it all depends on where this lands. So right now we're in this period of a 90-day moratorium while the Trump administration tries to cut deals with dozens and dozens of countries. But China is not a part of that ecosystem. So, sorry, they are a part of that ecosystem, but they're not exempt, from this kind of trading situation. So we are deep in a escalating trade war with China at this point. If you're companies like TSMC and you're wondering, are we going to invest in America? Are we not going to invest in America? There have been examples in which leading technology companies made promises to the first Trump administration, and then actually what they did is just wait out the end of the administration. I mean, Apple said they were going to open multiple factories during the first Trump administration that they never actually did. And so, what you need to understand is this policy environment stable enough for you to have confidence in the return on investment? And if you're not going to be doing that, you're going to be left with the status quo plus increased prices. So the chips are still going to be made in Taiwan, but now they're going to also be subject to tariffs. So you're not getting the industrial policy benefit until you have clear, durable, consistent policymaking.
And so what does it mean for prices like iPhones or other, washing machines, things that use chips? What does it mean for that? Prices go up,
there was an article in, I think it was the New York Times today that basically said, buy an iPhone right now. I mean, I saw that Apple was flying multiple jets just full of thousands of iPhones into the United States right now because the initial tranche of tariffs did not just cover China, where the most iPhones are manufactured, but it also covered countries like Vietnam, countries like India, where China has tried to shift production in response to earlier U.S. economic security concerns about China. And that is playing out in the case of Apple. It's playing out in the case of companies like Dell or Nvidia, who are trying to make servers that integrate these AI chips. So the broader overall ecosystem is kind of whirling to figure out that this deeply, deeply international supply chain that they've built over decades, what needs to change and where can they actually go to find some safety in this new geopolitical trade environment.
And certainly these companies are hoping for this reprieve to last longer than 90 days because they want to be able to do business in Vietnam. They want to be able to do business in India. China, they might have to write off for quite some time, but they also want to be able to do business in China. Apple clearly wants to be able to do business in China.
Yes.
Greg, all right. So let's move on to China, actually, and, Chinese firms demanding H20s. First of all, tell us what H20s are and what this whole situation's about.
So it all goes back to the chip export controls adopted by the Biden administration. And as the Biden administration has basically said, you can't sell the highest performing AI chips, and they've defined technical performance characteristics as what, characterizes an advanced AI chip. What Nvidia has done is basically said, okay, we're going to make the most attractive chip that we can make that is still compliant with those export controls. And at least since October 2023, the best chip that they can make that's compliant is this H20 chip, which is not so great for training, but is good for inferencing AI models.
Okay, and so we actually have some news today about export controls. What is that news?
So there's been a big change. I mean, everything that I've been hearing from folks out of the Trump administration is that the H20 chip is going to be banned. Basically, they said not only did the Biden administration get the technical performance specifications wrong the first time around, which led to the H800 chip, but they got it wrong the second time around with this H20 chip because China is buying tens of billions of dollars worth of these H20 chips because they're still good enough to do advanced AI work. And everybody had been saying that the Trump administration was going to, quote unquote, close this loophole and ban exports of the H20. But literally just today at 11:53, NPR put out a story citing two anonymous sources that actually the Trump administration, after a meeting between Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang and Donald Trump himself at Mar-a-Lago, that the Trump administration is backing off these H20 export controls. So what that means is that billions and billions of dollars of these sales are actually going to go through. If this report is true, and I should say they're the only ones reporting this right now.
And let's say it is true. Is this in keeping with what President Biden had set forth? Because we've talked about this a lot on this podcast, that, you know, the whole rationale is we want to keep China behind us when it comes to AI. This is one way of doing it, but also having American businesses be able to, you know, do business in China. So we're trying to thread a very difficult needle. Does this do that?
It is a very difficult needle to thread. And I would say that certainly amongst the AI policymakers in the Biden administration, sentiment had really turned by the late Biden administration. And I honestly think that if Biden had stayed in office for 3 more months, they probably would have banned H20 exports. So I think their sense is that, no, this is not threading the needle adequately because the H20 is just too good of a chip. Now, it's worth pointing out here that Nvidia is now shipping their latest and greatest chip, these Blackwells, which are multiple times higher performing than even the H100s that are banned. So even if China buys a lot of these H20s, there still is going to be a performance gap. But the basic point is, like, can they still, just by incurring more cost and more complexity, can they still, you know, keep pace with frontier AI labs in the United States? And at least, you know, coming out of folks like Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, they say the H20 is just too good and you're helping China more than you should.
I feel like we're going to have to make, you know, computer chip trading cards so we can keep all the different models straight.
Yeah,
you know,
I'm sure like there's a niche business out there to be created up for an Etsy store or something.
Maybe we'll create AI policy podcast trading cards. Let's also talk about, there's some other news. The Trump administration has actually issued new AI guidance. They put out a couple documents. What was in these documents?
So this is coming out of the White House Office of Management and Budget. That is run by Russ Vought, who is a very powerful person in the Trump administration. He had the same role in the first Trump administration and wrote, you know, guidelines for AI regulation in the United States the first time around. These two documents that have come out, the first one is called Accelerating Federal Use of AI Through Innovation, Governance, and Public Trust. And that really, I think, says it all. These documents are about making sure that the U.S. federal government uses AI more and uses it more effectively. And I think there's actually a lot in these documents to like. Some of it is consistent with what was in the previous Biden administration directives on similar topics. But some of it is, frankly, you know, just more aggressive. And one thing that I really appreciate that they've done here, having served, you know, in the U.S. government and tried to accelerate AI adoption, is they really want people and AI champions in federal agencies to identify what are all the policy blockers that you run into when you're trying to adopt AI. Like, what are the 10 million compliance, you know, standards that you have to face and that make, you know, an AI project that should be a weekend into like a 2-year initiative. So one way of thinking about this is like, if you're trying to water your garden and there's a kink in the hose, well, you can try and like crank up the water pressure a ton, or you can try and unkink the hose. And this document is really about identifying those kinks in the hose that are preventing us from, quote unquote, watering the garden of AI. And I really admire that.
Well, that's interesting. There was also another memo. It was called Driving Efficient Acquisition of Artificial Intelligence in Government. What was the purpose of that?
So I think here there's a lot of different purposes going on. They stated explicitly that there are three grounding themes that drive this memorandum. So, quote, ensuring the government and the public benefit from a competitive American AI marketplace, safeguarding taxpayer dollars by tracking AI performance and managing risk, and promoting effective AI acquisition with cross-functional engagement. So here I think it's pretty interesting is they're talking about just how hard it is to buy AI. So while there are parts of the U.S. government that have like really high quality researchers who are more than capable of developing an AI model, like in the Department of Energy or in NIST or in NSF, et cetera, almost all of the AI that the government uses is probably going to be developed by private companies and purchased by the federal government. And so what they're saying is, in the acquisition processes, what are all those kinks in the hose? And not just that, but what are all those demonstrated best practices that actually can move all of this faster? And how can we make sure that if DoD discovers something clever about implementing AI, how do we make sure that other federal agencies are quickly made aware of those best practices? So I think it's pretty good stuff.
So in your view, I guess you would characterize this as a good continuation of some things Biden started.
Yeah, I mean, just to name some similarities, the Biden administration required all the federal agencies to create a chief AI officer. This memorandum, reinstates that requirement, but also creates like formal mechanisms by which those chief AI officers are supposed to share best practices, meet every 90 days, that kind of a thing. The other thing is that it does acknowledge the existence of what they call high impact AI. So this is AI that, could relate to civil liberties, AI that could relate to critical infrastructure or something that could lead to, safety hazards. And it does put in place, hey, if you are going to use AI for a high impact use case, that's not banned, but you do have to understand what you're taking on here. You can't casually introduce AI into a high-risk use case without having an understanding about whether you are mitigating specific risks or accepting specific risks. And that's exactly what was in the Biden administration version as well.
Greg, finally today, I want to talk about the EU. They have a new AI continent action plan, they're calling it. What the heck is this thing, and what does it actually mean?
So they call it an action plan. I think that's a charitable name for what this is. Now, I used to be in the DoD where I was the director of AI strategy and policy. And I want to just point out that a disease that both the Europeans have and the American government has is we released a document that is basically a wish list of nice things that we hope will happen, and we call it a strategy. And I think there's some of this in that this new document, the AI Continent Action Plan. It's suddenly become fashionable, to call your strategy documents an action plan. A lot of this is a wish list of nice things that they want to have happen. So it says, for example, mobilize 200 billion euros in investment. That's actually something that they had already forecast back in February. But the key here is mobilize, right? So it's not like they're giving the money. They're basically saying, go talk to a bunch of private sector people and gin up $200 billion investment. There's also, a lot of focus here around big data centers and making sure that the EU has massive data center infrastructure, what they're calling these AI gigafactories or AI factories. And there's a couple things that I think are sort of interesting in that. Number one, having those large-scale data centers on European soil is framed in terms of economic security and economic sovereignty. And I think that actually is reflective of a lot of European concerns about their dependence upon American tech companies. So this is sort of the trade war now manifesting itself in what the EU says are its aspirations. It says they want their own AI chips. They don't want to be dependent on Nvidia anymore. It says that they want their own AI data centers. They don't want to be renting from Microsoft or renting from Google anymore. So here's where you can see, thorny issues between the United States and Europe, like these tariffs, like the diffusion rule. they're actually now finding their way, not explicitly, but I would argue implicitly, into these policy documents where the EU is basically saying, we don't trust the Americans anymore, and we need to do something to create a domestic alternative. Now, that's way easier said than done, but at least, they're saying it now.
Greg, really appreciate it. We've got through a lot of ground today, and I know in our next episode, we're going to have a lot more to talk about because this situation is fluid. Thank you very much for all this insight today.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. If you like what you heard, there's an easy way for you to help us. Please give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe. And tell your friends. It really helps spread the word. This podcast was produced by Sarah Baker, Isaac Goldston, and Sadie McCullough. See you next time.